All right, we're live.
Hi, John. How are you?
I'm doing great. And we have a guest on, Egil, but he's actually getting his coffee right now. So we'll add him back in when he shows up.
Yeah, I definitely hear him. Totally got to get your coffee first thing in the morning. I've got mine, so I don't blame him.
Well, this is an exciting show. This is our first monthly Blazor Focus show. So, so this is great. So I am actually going to be the kind of more quiet person and let you kind of run the show. So
yeah, I'm really looking forward to this. I think it's going to be super fun. And I think so many things happen in Blazor every month that it helps to kind of sit down, take a look at everything and kind of find things to share with folks.
So one thing I just remembered, and somebody reminded us of this recently, is that we should introduce ourselves every show because we have new people showing up. So my name's John Galloway, and I'm a PM on the .NET community team. And then Safia?
Yeah, I am Safia. I am an engineer on the ASP.NET team. I spend most of my time working on Blazor, hence me being on the Blazor Community Standup. And our guest today is Egil Hansen. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I can. So yes, I'm Egil Hansen, as you said, Safia, and I think my title is principal developer, and I work for a Danish consultancy called Delegate, and I'm also the creator and maintainer of bUnit, which we're going to talk about today, Blazor testing library.
Awesome.
Oh, and Microsoft MVP. That's definitely also a title I'm very proud of.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being on the show. I'm really excited to have you come in and talk about bUnit. I think it's a super relevant and important topic for people to know about, testing their software. So any tool that helps developers do that is a boon in my eyes.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Yeah, so let's get started. And I want to get started by actually going through some community highlights. We did this at the last Blazor Community Stand-Up, and I want to do it again for this community stand-up. And our community highlight should be up on screen right now.
Yep.
Is Dave Brock. So Dave Brock actually made a contribution to the documentation in Blazor. Docs are super important. You should never forget about them. One of the big features that we rolled out in Blazor for .NET 5 was support for CSS isolation. And it was a relatively interesting feature to document because you had to actually document how to use the feature, some of the customizations you could make in the build tooling to extend upon the feature. For example, if you wanted to use like Sass or CSS or some other CSS preprocessor. So Dave actually took it upon himself to write most of the documentation for CSS isolation. You can actually see he's credited here. I did some help editing, Javier did some help editing, but it was really awesome that it was pretty much just Dave doing the work on this particular feature. So thank you, Dave, so much for taking the time to write docs. They're super awesome. I think lots of people found them helpful, and this is definitely great to have for folks out there.
So Safia, if other people are inspired by this and want to do the same sort of thing, what did Dave do to get started? Like, because, you know, do people just say, hey, here's a big doc I wrote, or do they coordinate with you, or how does that work?
Yeah, great question. So there's different degrees of participation here. We do have issues in our ASP.NET Core docs repo. You can see I've listed the repo on the slide here. So if you go and find an issue of something that we want to document that you're interested in working on, you can comment, hey, I'd like to provide some content here. And usually what will happen is you'll provide some initial content, and then our documentation writers and engineers are going to work with you to refine it. So that's if you want to kind of like drop bigger pieces of content. You can kind of find an issue to work on or open an issue and propose some documentation that you want to add. And if you're looking to make a quick modification, like maybe you notice there's a typo in the documentation page somewhere, we try and avoid that, but you know, things happen. There's actually, if you go to the docs.microsoft page, there's an edit button at the top right of every docs.microsoft page, and it will take you right to where you can edit the docs in place on GitHub and allow you to open a PR. So you can make quick edits and modifications inline, and then we'll kind of go through the process of reviewing them and polishing them up before they go live. Mm-hmm. Cool. I actually really liked your question about participating and contributing, because it's me shamelessly telling people about the Blazor sprints again. I mentioned this last month, but we have continued to do our monthly Blazor community sprints. They happen on the first or second Tuesday of every month. So the next one is December 10th. And it's a pretty low-key day where you can open a PR against Blazor to fix one of our help wanted issues. And folks on the Blazor team will be available to provide mentorship or walk you through design via the Gitter. So if you've ever wanted to contribute, but you were worried that you weren't going to do the right thing, or you don't know how to fix a particular issue, or any of those like various things that hold you back, this is a great opportunity to like come in, get help, and get a PR out there, and then hopefully keep contributing. Cool. All right. I think it's time for community links, John.
I think so.
I think so. Cool. We should see community links. Let me zoom into this.
We need some like music for community links.
We do. We need a jingle. We should get on Fiverr or something and get a jingle. Cool. So last week we released .NET 5, which was super exciting. And we had .NET Conf. So I went in and curated a couple of links to .NET Conf talks that I really liked. And then there's kind of like one blog post that I thought was interesting. So I'm just going to go through them right now, talk a little bit about all of the fun stuff that's out there. So first things first, it's actually not a .NET Conf talk, but it was, I think there was a .NET Conf presentation on the same topic by Michael Stabe, who's the creator of Hot Chocolate, which is a library, a .NET library for interacting with GraphQL, which is a backend data manipulation and subscription API. So Michael was on .NET TV, and he was talking about Hot Chocolate, which, by the way, I think it's just the funnest name for a library ever. Hot Chocolate. I think he's got another one that's like strawberry ice cream or something. So I love really named projects like that. And so in this presentation, he walks you through creating a Blazor WebAssembly application with a GraphQL backend, setting up subscriptions for that application, GraphQL subscriptions, and how his tool Hot Chocolate could be used. I really like this talk because you get to see how the creator of a tool uses it, which I think is always insightful because you kind of learn best practices via osmosis by observing what they do. So yeah, I really like this talk. Michael is a great presenter in this case. He's got his demo down solid. And yeah, I would totally recommend you check it out. I will be posting.
These are really great shows too. Cecil does such a good job hosting people on these. I just love watching those shows.
Yeah, I love to listen to them on the background as like company when I'm working from home, just have some voices and listen to some interesting conversation. So definitely check it out. Cool. Next up is actually a .NET Conf talk with a very intriguing title. It's called Micro Frontends with Blazor. Welcome to the party. Michelle is introing, but the main speaker here is Florian Rappel. And he kind of talks us through the concept of building micro frontends with Blazor. If you're familiar with microservices, micro frontends are the same concept brought to the UI. It's essentially the idea that you can structure your user interface in such a way that correlated pieces of business logic can live together, be developed together, and deployed together, and then aggregated on your application's page. So if you had an e-commerce platform, you could have a micro front end for your cart, and you could have a micro front end for the catalog for your e-commerce platform, and a micro front end for the checkout. And then all of those micro front ends get stitched together for your complete e-commerce UI. So in this talk, Florian talks you through what micro front ends are. I really like the way he introduced micro front ends. He kind of starts off with the same comparison I did, where he's like, hey, here's microservices, and then builds up into micro front ends, and then kind of introduces Blazor and how you can implement a micro front end infrastructure with Blazor. Fun stuff.
I really, really like that because I feel like, Blazor is web technology, and part of what really is great with web technology is you can fit the different parts together, and you don't have to make one big choice at the beginning, like, oh, this is a Blazor app, or this is an MVC app, or, and so really being able to kind of put those parts together and have little islands and, stitch things together is great. One other cool thing, Florian Rappel also builds an Angle Sharp library, which is a really, really cool, it's a great library for parsing and generating all kinds of stuff with HTML. So
it's funny you say that. Angle Sharp is used in bUnit because we don't have a browser, so we have to use something else to, be able to sort of build up a virtual DOM, and that's Angle Sharp. So yeah, I know him a little bit. He's been helping out with bUnit as well. He's a great guy, a very, very talented developer. So definitely check out his talk there.
Awesome. Wow, small world. I love that all of these different projects are connected and things follow up super nicely. Cool. The third community link is actually not a video, it's a blog post. I liked this blog post for two reasons. So this is a blog post where a user walks you through how to build a kind of like a mini IDE in the browser. So let me scroll down through all this code here. So you can see you can upload a zip file of your application or any .NET project, and then you can edit the contents of the file in your browser. So there's two things I really like about this blog post. Actually, correction, three things I really like about this blog post. Number one, it's really straight to the point, lots of code samples. So if you're someone who kind of wants to build something up quickly or is looking to kind of start off with a tutorial and then build on top of it, this is a great tutorial format for you. Second thing I really like is the visual up top here. So this is the visual of the Flux architecture of the application. Flux is essentially a model for reasoning about state and how state should be modified in a web application. And the author does a really great job of outlining all of the different components and how they look. And I love pictures. These pictures are so great. And the third thing that I like about this presentation is if you watched Steve and I's .NET Conf talk last week, where we talked about some of the new features that were coming out in Blazor, we had talked about, or we had demoed using a Monaco editor in a Blazor application. And for that demo, Steve had actually built a NuGet package that wrapped the Monaco editor as a Blazor component. And this tutorial actually uses that same component that Steve made for our demo. So I thought it was really interesting that our demo code is catching fire. We're seeing it in blog posts and things like that. So that's super fun. Yeah, so if you're, yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, I was going to finish it off and say, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about Flux and want a really straight to the point and concise tutorial to get you started, this is definitely an awesome one.
I really like how Blazor is definitely doing its own thing, and it's, you know, it's taking advantage of the .NET ecosystem and all that, but it's also learning from other existing things that are out there. So Flux, very popular in the React ecosystem. It's worked well, it's mature. And so it's great to not always, you know, and it's very easy to wrap and integrate these things with Blazor as well, because it's standard web technologies. So
yeah,
it's cool to see.
That's a great point to call out. Yeah, so if you learn Flux Redux architecture, you're not just learning a Blazor thing, you're going to be able to use it in a variety of different frameworks. Cool. And last but not least, we write code. It works great. It's got shiny features. We have to test it because otherwise bugs will happen and we'll be in trouble. Oh, there's John. That's super fun. It's two Johns on screen.
Yeah.
If this is unsettling, John, I can scroll forward.
Yeah, maybe scroll to Ed. Yeah, that's much better.
Cool. So this is a presentation from .NET Conf that is all about testing Blazor applications. This is actually a great segue into the topic of today's community stand-up, because we're going to be talking all about bUnit and testing. This talk actually introduces bUnit and talks a little bit about it, as well as a variety of other frameworks, including XUnit, which is listed here. It showcases the Telerik Test Studio and kind of talks about how you can build a really robust testing infrastructure for your Blazor components using all of these different technologies. What I really liked about this talk is, you know, as someone who's on the Blazor team, one of the questions that we hear a lot is like, oh, is Blazor ready for prime time? And I think there's a variety of different factors to consider there when I say yes, but one of the most compelling ones is there a robust testing infrastructure around Blazor? Can you like ship applications and have the tests running behind them to be confident and know that they're going to work well in production? And this talk is actually a great testament to that. So I'd strongly recommend that you check it out. But before you check it out, I want to hand it off to Egil, who is joining us here today. And he's going to be talking all about bUnit. So Egil, take it away. I will stop sharing my presentation. The community links are over.
I will start sharing my screen. 1 second.
And the community links should be scrolling through the bottom of the screen. So check them out.
Yeah,
awesome.
And you should have my screen now.
Yep, all right.
Yeah. Let me just untangle myself from the cables here. Okay. So as you mentioned, Ed did a fantastic job of introducing bUnit. I was really happy with his with just covering the basic stuff, how to use it. So I thought instead of sort of redoing what he did, and I probably couldn't do it as well as he could, I'm just gonna maybe go into the basics of how bUnit work to give people an understanding of how it works, and maybe sort of help people sort of maybe have an easier start with bUnit. Not that it's hard, it's definitely not the point, but just maybe clear up some of the questions that might show up. So let me get my clicker working as well. Okay, so yeah, I don't want to talk about the basics because Ed already did that very well. And if after watching Ed's talk you want to learn a lot more, I've been working hard on the documentation on the bUnit.egilhansen.com website. Also with help from Pact, the publishing company, who kindly lent me an editor who helped sort of improve my spelling and typing and all of that. So hopefully there's a lot of documentation there to get people started. So let's talk about what bUnit should be and what it should do. So the design goals has always been for me to make it as easy as possible to test your Blazor components. So as easy as it is to test plain old C# object, a POCO. So that means having the framework come out of box with some defaults that in most cases will have people have that experience of, they write a test that they think makes sense and it works as expected. It should be fast. So if we wanted to do integration testing or use something like TerraX Studio or Selenium or something else that basically runs the full Blazor runtime, you can do that, and that works quite well. But one thing it's not easy to set up, and it's not very fast compared to just running your regular unit tests. So that's something I also want with bUnit. I also want to make it easy to work with HTML, because that's the primary thing that at least Blazor for the web produces. If we are looking into the Xamarin and mobile Blazor bindings, obviously that's something else that we produce, but for the regular Blazor, that's HTML we produce. So we want to make it easy for people to work with the HTML that the components produce. And that's where AngleSharp, as you mentioned before, come in. And then it should also be easy to pass in dependencies to components. So that's sort of the I guess, the overarching goals. There are other guiding things, but in general, it should be intuitive and easy to use. And this is sort of what we want to be able to do. So to explain how bUnit work, I'm going to attempt to explain how I understand Blazor and the sort of core concepts of Blazor. And it's a bit scary because we have a Blazor developer team member here with us, so I might make a mistake, and please correct me, Safia, if I do. So I feel like I'm at the exam, but I'm going to try anyway. So here goes. So the first thing, we have sort of three concepts I sort of think are essential for Blazor and the architecture of Blazor. And the first thing is obviously the components that we are working with. Then we have something in Blazor that manages the components. And the third thing we have is something that manages the user interface. And so what is a component? A component is, in practice, just a basic C# class that implements iComponent. Or I guess more commonly, I see a Blazor component is something that inherits from component base. So that's good because a simple thing is just something we can easily test. So it's just a class that has either of these properties normally. The thing that manages the components, that is sort of what I would call the Blazor C# runtime, the thing that runs in on the server side in .NET Core, or the thing that runs in the WebAssembler runtime that we have in the browser. So it sort of is responsible for managing the lifetime of the components. It makes sure that if the component has dependencies on services, those are injected into the component and made available. It's in general, I guess, builds and maintains the component tree of the render tree that sort of represents the application that we want the runtime to show to the user. And the thing that manages the user interface is the Blazor browser runtime, which is JavaScript based, and that is responsible for creating and maintaining a DOM tree. So we can show something on the screen to the user. It also listens to input from the user and browser events, such as if the user clicks a button, or if you navigate to a different page, then there's a browser event for that, and lots of other types of events that you can hook into. And so how are these two sort of big components here, or two concepts at the bottom, connected? Well, they talk to each other. Oh, sorry. Of course, I forgot to mention that the Blazor's JavaScript runtime also, if there's any component, if a component has any JavaScript, obviously that also runs down in the browser as part of, maybe not directly part of the Blazor runtime, but it's running in the browser at least. So how do these two communicate? Well, the Blazor C# runtime, it sends render tree updates down to, well, over to the JavaScript runtime that takes those updates, the render tree updates, and updates the DOM tree and refreshes so that the user sees the changes from the component. And the opposite is that when the user does something, or there's anything that happens in the browser that the Blazor runtime, C# runtime should know about, then there's UI commands or things being called in the C# runtime there. And we also have, obviously, we have sort of a two-way street, which is the JavaScript interrupt between the JavaScript world of Blazor and the C# world of Blazor, which is sort of, they can call both directions. So the sort of main design goals I had for bUnit was not to be dependent on the big browser box over here, because if we want to do that, we could use Selenium or Telerik Test Studio or whatnot to sort of run the whole thing together. So what can we do instead if we can't use the browser? And that's just sort of where I think Steve and the Blazor team did a really good job of creating an architecture that is replaceable and pluggable. So we can replace the browser-based browser parts of the Blazor runtime with something else, and that is what been done with the mobile Blazor bindings that sort of generates Xamarin and Android code and iOS code, I guess. But we can also do the same thing for testing. So what do we need instead? So what really we want to have. We want to run our test as just regular unit tests. So instead of having a browser that is doing some things there, we have an XUnit or NUnit or MS Test, just a regular test project from either of those libraries. And inside that, we have our test, which we can put, in which bUnit provides a test context for. And the test context sort of takes over the role that the browser JavaScript components had before of Blazor. So it allows us to set up dependencies that a component we want to test, that a component we want to render has. That could be cascading values, that could be services. It depends on like data service or even the IJS runtime service. Or HTTP client or navigation manager, all those things. It could also be just the context of which you want to sort of render the component in. Then we can ask the bUnit test context to render a component or re-render a component if need be. The bUnit test context gives us access to the component we have rendered. So that's also, I guess, an advantage of having this thing just be entirely C# is that we have access to the component we are rendering. Whereas I guess if you're working with something like Test Studio or Test Cafe or one of those where you're basically instrumenting a browser to drive a test, then you don't really have access to the component instance if you're to be able to expect that during your test. The bUnit test context also uses AngleSharp to create a DOM tree that represents the rendered markup from the component we are testing, and that allows us to query it like you would do in the browser with your typical CSS selectors and stuff like that. And it also allows us to trigger event handlers so that we can communicate back to the Blazor runtime. So the reason why I have this big green box going around both the Blazor C# runtimes and the test code is because the process that runs bUnit test is just for example, the XUnit test project. So it's all in the same process. And indeed, it is actually the test context that sort of runs or I guess owns the Blazor C# runtime parts, and bUnit also has some hooks into that so that we are able to listen into and understand when there's renders happens and can sort of be more proactive and be intelligent about that. Obviously, the render tree updates still flow through the Blazor C# runtimes into the bUnit context, so we can re-render the DOM tree and notify user that in the test that changes has happened. And there is, because we are not running in a browser, and that's sort of a common first question I sometimes get from people is that, well, how can I test my JavaScript code with bUnit? And the answer is you can't, because there's no JavaScript runtime in bUnit. It's all C#. That's the thing that allows us to run fast and work well, because we don't have a browser here. But that also can that requires us to work around that by providing a mock or a fake JavaScript interrupt thing in bUnit that allows you to simulate that there is some JavaScript on the other end that your component might be calling, but obviously it's not the real thing. So it's like, I guess in essence, it's similar to if you had some sort of data service that you would be calling. You wouldn't be calling your web service during your unit test. You would have a mock of that, and then you would have some fake response that sort of matches your expectations for that particular test. The same thing is what we have to do with JavaScript interrupt. Another small thing that I want to cover is that these two things, the Blazor runtime of the Blazor renderer that sort of handles and maintains the components, it runs in its own thread, and the bUnit test runs in its thread. And that is because there can be situations where a component has some asynchronous logic that causes it to asynchronously render. And if we have some tests that are basically, well, if without this, we would end up in deadlocks. So that's sort of but I think for the most part, bUnit sort of hides this effect, and you don't really have to think about it. But there are a few times if you're doing a lot of asynchronous work in your component, you're testing, where you need to use a little bit of extra stuff in bUnit. I can show a little bit of that here in a demo shortly. So I think that sort of gives a good basic understanding of how bUnit works and where you can use it. And I saw one question, for example, from I think Ed's talk on this, where somebody asked, "Can I run bUnit in my CI and CD continuous integration environment in Azure Pipelines, for example?" And you can run bUnit anywhere. You can run .NET tests. So it's just a classic XUnit test project. There's nothing special about it, and so it's very portable. So do we have any questions for now, or should I show a little bit of code?
No questions on what you just showed. I think folks are ready to see some demo code.
Okay.
By the way, I love the way that you structured your explanation. I think the core concept of interaction between Blazor and the DOM comes up in a lot of talks. And it's always interesting to see how different developers present it. And I think you did a really good job. So
okay, thank you. That's good.
Awesome.
So let me move my. So I think we just have, I don't know how much time we have actually, but so I can show a few things. So this is just a very simple and basic bUnit test. And the test context I talked about before, the one we have here, this is an XUnit. I can just show you, this is just a regular XUnit project. So I just have some XUnit includes here and I have bUnit. And this is the very latest nightly preview from the GitHub package repository. But other than that, it's just a .NET 5 project, and that's it. So because of how XUnit works, the bUnit test context we can just inherit from that, and then we have access to sort of some of the things we need. And if we just want to have a simple test of this, I've actually upgraded a little bit, but this is sort of the classic counter component that we've all seen to death in some, I think, all presentations by now of Blazor, where you can click a button and it just magically works, and there's no postback or anything view state anymore. So if we want to test this, it's as simple as telling bUnit to render the component. We do it like this. And then we get a component under test. Then we can use, this is sort of a find API that's similar to if you have worked with jQuery before, but it's basically a way to say, I'm going to pass in a CSS selector. In this case, I'm just going to select the button on the page. So in this case, it's going to be this guy here. And then I'm going to get that back. I'm going to call click on that. And that's sort of an extension that bUnit comes with that allows that reads the markup and finds the event handler that we have registered for the counter, and it allows us to call that back and sort of trigger this this method here. And we can put a breakpoint here and we can run it to have it look. And then we have a sort of I guess this is sort of some of the secret sauce, a special sauce I have with bUnit. There's actually another library I made back last year around this time called Angle Sharp Diffing, which builds on Angle Sharp, and it's sort of a semantic comparison library that is that is included in bUnit, but allows us to actually be very specific and say, I want to have this exact markup, but still want to have it in a very a flexible manner within the bounds of what HTML would render in the browser, and like it has to be still have to be semantically the same markup, but it doesn't have to be from a string comparison point equivalent, and that's sort of built into here. I can, if we, I'm not sure if this is gonna be large enough to show, but and I'm not sure if I have the right. I just got a new computer recently, so I'm not sure if I set up my Zoom. Windows Plus. Okay.
Or maybe not.
Or maybe not. Well, it's just have to Windows Plus.
That's supposed to
we have definitely zoomed. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna step through and try to manage my mouse. So rendering component. Sorry for the jumps here. Rendering component gives us a component on the test. And as you can see in here, we have a bunch of things we can look at. We can look at the instance, like I mentioned before, where we can see this is actually the component instance, as you can see here, the page.counter file. So we have access to the actual component. We can also look at the markup that has been rendered. Oh my. Yeah. And here you can see the rendered output. And you can see this is sort of a special attribute that bUnit, it takes the event handler and writes it out in a little bit prettier way so that it's easier to recognize in your code. But basically, we have an event handler here that has the event handler ID of 1. So now if we use the find method, and obviously I changed it here so we can't really see the intermediate result, but the find method will find the button for us, and that allows us to click it. So now we've jumped into, and as you can see, we're into the counter component, and we are actually here in the increment count method. And if we step over that, we will increment the count. At this point, when we return from here, we jump back to the test. But what has happened is that the Blazor renderer has now been told to re-render the component. And once I step over again, I'm sorry for the jumping around, but I'm not qualified to drive the zoom mode of Windows yet. We can see that the count has indeed been updated and increased. And I think I'm going to attempt to zoom out. There we go.
There you go. Yeah.
Minus and plus. That's actually intuitive enough. Okay, so here we have our markup matches that says I expect this markup to be here, and critically we want to have it count of 1. If you compare over here, obviously something like this, that's not part of the markup we expect. That's not the part of that the user won't see that markup in the browser. So we, at this point, we are certain against the markup we expect to have. And if I hit a 5, the test should pass. Where did my test explorer go? Here it is. And yeah, we just have a happy green test. So if I just want to sort of underscore the effect of having markup matches versus just using regular string testing. So if I change to good old assert equals that we've used so many times in our tests, regular unit tests, I need to add an S to this, I guess. Yeah. And this is the expected, and I can't always remember the order, but no, cut. We can just compare it with this mark. This is just a raw markup string from this is the wrong. You can see how much I use assert equal. So would you expect this to pass now?
I'm guessing no, because you told us.
Okay, I ruined the surprise here. But no, I actually didn't need to debug it. But if we look here while this is building, you can see that this is obviously set up a little bit different. And when we do, when we compare by equals, we have everything has to be the same. I'm just gonna click F5 and F5 and just come back here, and not surprisingly, it fails because As you can see, we expect something to look like this, but what we actually got was something like this. And that's because equals is strict, right? Because you want it to be match on everything, white space and everything. But if you go into a browser, and if you view this in the browser, it doesn't matter if you've written it like this, or if you say, I don't really like that extra white space, I want to have it like that. It's going to render the exact same in the browser. So that's sort of where the semantic comparison comes into play, and say, well, I don't actually need it to be exactly the same as it is. I just need to be semantically the same. So that means that one of the goals I had is it should be easy to maintain unit tests as well. And one of the things we don't want our test breaking when there's no business reason for it to break. Now, if it still is the same, we have the same output the user will see, then it's fine. We don't need to have it to break. So that is sort of where where markup matches comes into play, and really helps a lot. And another things it can do is that it can, even if, for example, you had a bunch of attributes here, if we had another ID attribute, for example, and it doesn't, like normally HTML doesn't care about the order of attributes. So I could, down here in my expected, I could add it here and it would be the same, but I could also have it over here and it would be fine as well. I could even choose to write my class like this if I want to have it, prettied up. It's now we're definitely into territory where it's not the same as we have here, but it's still the same from a browser's perspective. So if we run it, we should just get a green light again from our test explorer. And there's even more tricks of it. It has obviously, for example, if I change the order here of button and button primary, again in the browser won't complain about that. It's going to render it exactly the same. So this has some advantage. For example, in this case, we are getting our CSS classes from this method here, where we sort of building it up as we go, based on some cascading data we get down from our cascading parameter. So we might want to change that in our code. We might want to have a more sort of not have a more loose way of building our CSS classes up, for example. And this sort of helps with that. It also understands the style attribute if you are having inline styles. So it has a lot of tricks up sleeve, a lot more actually. You can also use, you can also have, if you just want to match with any ID value, if any ID is generated, you can actually say, well, I'm going to say this is going to be, you can have that sort of special modifiers that's in here. So you can say this is going to be something that is, yeah. So you have a lot of options here if you're automatically generating things. So you can actually, normally when you do UI testing, you go in and say, I'm going to look only at maybe the test content of this particular, I'm just going to look at, and you could, for example, write a thing like this where you say find p, and I'm going to say test context dot trim, and then I'm going to do my assert equals, and I'm going to check that current count equals 1, and then you're sort of pinpointing and going into specific things in your component. And that's also a fair way to go if you like to do that, or you don't want to have this very finely grained assertion. But normally I think it's not possible to do that in regular assertion frameworks where you're working with HTML, because you really have to specify everything exactly the same as you get it. Otherwise it's going to fail, or you're just going to be unstable as soon as somebody hits control KD and reformats your Razor file. Your test is breaking and it shouldn't really write. So this is sort of a way for bUnit to enable you to write stable tests.
Nice.
So,
yeah, totally blew my mind with that one. We've got some questions in the chat if you want to take some time to answer them.
Absolutely, yeah. Stop me, otherwise I'll keep talking.
No, I love that you're excited about this. It's really infectious. So one of the questions that's come up quite a bit in the chat is related to mocking. Folks are interested to see how JS interop is mocked out in the tests, as well as any other services. So do you think you can show us how that works?
Absolutely. So we can cover both in one swoop, because so IJS runtime, which we inject like this, I have a flashing counter here, but basically any type of services, you have some sort of something you inject in and you get that. And it's the same with JS runtime. So the IJS runtime we have it's just a service like anything else. And but in general, if you want to register a service you want to pass to a component, you have to do that in the test context before you call render component. And test context comes with a property called services. And this guy works exactly the same as your regular services from your program.cs, where you can call add scope. So if I have a component I want to render that requires something, I just go add singleton, and I might need to, I have to obviously have that's a bit much. So for example, if I want to add, we have a theme service. Let's say we have something like that, a theme service we want to inject in. And here we go. We just have to have the Microsoft extension injection thing. That's it. So you just register your service, and bUnit's text context will make sure that it's provided to the counter if it needs it. So it's just the same as you're doing with any types of service registration you're doing. And you can, that's what I'm sort of wanted to show maybe up here. Because it's in XUnit, the constructor is run at every test. So if you have a common service you need to use in all your tests, or you have a common mocks you use to use all your tests, you can just register them up in the constructor for the test. If you're using something like MOQ or Fake It Easy or InSubstitute or Telerex JustMock, that's just the same. You set up your mock like you would in a regular unit test. So people, if you ask the question, how do I do this? Just think, how would you do it if you have a classic plain old C# object that needed some dependency injected into it? The same principle here. We have the DI container that sort of allows you to register it, and doesn't have to be singleton. Doesn't matter really what type it is, because yeah. So
that's really
does that answer the
handy.
question?
Yeah, that looks really handy to me. I've seen, a lot of testing frameworks, you have to write so much setup and teardown code. And so to be able to inject a service like that looks really useful.
Yeah, and this is not really about bUnit, because this is just how XUnit works. If you implement iDisposable and you just add a dispose method, that will run after each test. So this is just and if it's NUnit, then you have your setup and you have your teardown methods. So, but yeah, services is there to inject services.
Cool.
I'm curious to know, can you walk us through a scenario of, say, would we be able to validate that a JS interop invocation is made from a bUnit test?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me quickly show this first, though, before. So now that I have it up here on screen. So another thing that we want sometimes when we want to render a component in the context of another component, sometimes maybe you're using a component library that requires you to, in the base of your component, like we do here, for example, we have the router type that you wrap basically your whole application with that. And if you need to do that as well, for example, in this case, we want to pass down the cascading value of theme to our component here. If we have sort of a common thing where we always want to do that, we can just call the render tree property similar to services. We could call render tree property, and then we can just add components into the render tree that the component on the test, the render counter, will be rendered inside. So that's sort of a new feature that is just recently been released, but that should make it easier for third-party component vendors to have sort of a very simple test context dot add Telerex bUnit support, for example. And that would set up all their special needs to be able to test with, for example, test components that use their components with bUnit. But so just a side step. But I hope that more of the component vendors will help out with providing this type of support, because that will make it much easier for people to use their tests. To get back to your question about using JS interrupt. So if we, I don't have my plugin for XUnit here. I have one of those nice ones where you can just type fact and click tap. So I have to do it manually. Okay. Anyway, the next version of bUnit, which is just in the nightlies right now, it will have a property called JS interrupt, because the fake fake/mock, depending on how you define these test doubles. But the fake JavaScript interrupt that is built into bUnit will, from the next version, be always on, meaning that it will always be available and registered to the services. But it will be, if you know mock terminology, it will be registered as in strict mode, meaning that if it receives a JS invocation from a component to JavaScript that it isn't set up to handle, which is what you were asked about, then it will throw an exception. So if you look at our flashing counter example here, we're calling invoke avoid async and calling flash counter on that. So if I just render that and run this flashing counter. So if you run this test, we should see an output that sort of tells us that this is failing because we haven't set something up to handle that. Actually, it won't fail because I'm not clicking the button yet. So let me cancel that run. And let's just go and run. So what I am building in the next release of bUnit is adding in a first-party support for the components that comes out of the box from Blazor that uses JavaScript interrupt. So that would be the virtualize component that I believe you built, right, Safia? Or at least I've seen you present about it.
That was actually our intern who built that.
Okay.
But it does use JS interrupt quite heavily under the hood.
Yes. Yeah, and I kind of want to have people that it just works feeling. So if they're using virtualize in their components, I want to have a built-in handler for those particular calls, so that it'll just spit out everything that is being virtualized, for example. So we don't have to, there's no delay, there's no scrolling you need to do. But as you can see here, when we run this test, we get an exception from bUnit saying there's no invocation for flash counter without arguments. That we didn't expect that one. So that allows us to do the opposite, to verify that it's actually there. And basically, you can go in here and say set up void. In this case, we want to set up void, and we're just going to say, well, I'm going to expect that to be a, what was the name, flashing counter, a call of that. And then we get a handler back. And then we can take the handler and say verify, say, what is it? Verify. Now I can't remember how to use my own library. But yeah, that is invocations. And then you can look into the invocations and you can sort of see the invocation that has happened. I think I'm missing a using statement somewhere, or maybe it's just because I'm on the very previous bits. So yeah, you're definitely able to inspect it. If you are using a third-party library in your code and you don't know what calls are going to happen, like sometimes you don't know what they have been using. So you can also just go say JS interrupt mock mode, and you can set that to loose. So that will just, when it gets an invocation, in this case, if it gets this one flash counter, then it'll just register it as an invocation, and it'll return the default value. Or in this case, it was a void, so it'll just return and say, yeah, everything is fine. And then you can go in and inspect that afterwards. Or maybe it's not important to you to inspect the JavaScript. And yeah, I think my
with
previous
this loose mode, I won't get any exceptions thrown if invocations are made that I don't assert on.
Yeah, and you can instead go in and just inspect that you get the invocations you expect. So it's sort of very similar to MOQ, which I've been using before in that regard, and I think most in Substitute as well. It's just whatever syntax it is. So, yeah.
There's one question that came in, and I think there's two parts that I'm interested in. So this question is, doesn't asserting markup lead to fragile tests? And you did show that your markup matches is semantic matching. So you're like just formatting, adding a space or whatever it's still going to match.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's the whole point. Yeah. About it.
Is there another, can I match directly on a property? Can I say I'm expecting just this class or whatever, because maybe I don't want to match on the entire markup there?
Absolutely. So the usual pattern I see is that people will use the find, or there's a find all method for that matter, that takes a CSS selector. So if you want to find all the p tags, you can use find or find all. Find will just find the one. If it doesn't find anything, it will throw an exception actually. But find all will just return an empty list in that case. But then you get an element out in this case, and element is just well, let me zoom in again. Element is something from Egil Hansen called an I element, and if you want to, for example, verify that this guy has, right, this dual screen thing is a little bit challenging with Zoom. So if you want to verify that it, for example, has the class property, you can just say has, oh boy, let me zoom out again. Now we have seen in. So it has attribute, for example. You can say, well, do you have a class attribute? Or you can call get attributes, and then you can, do your regular assertion with your favorite assertion library. Like there's no bUnit doesn't dictate if you want to use assert, the built-in assertion library for XUnit, or if you want to use Fluent assertions or Shootly or whatever. Everything works. So you can. So this is find method will return an element from the DOM tree, and you can traverse that. You can also, if you want to go about it different, you can go to cut.nodes. Nodes is the angle sharp, the root of the angle sharp DOM tree that has been rendered from your component. So you can, very similar to what you would do in JavaScript in the browser, you can use that to traverse the DOM tree and pinpoint the specific parts you want to assert against. Okay. So yeah, definitely, there's many ways to assert. You don't have to use the markup matches and similar methods to do that semantic comparison.
Very cool.
Another question that popped up on the chat is, how does this work? This works with both Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly, correct?
Yeah, let me show the slide again. So there's no Blazor Server here. There's no Blazor client. It's just C#. And so yes, the short answer is it doesn't even run in server or client mode. It just we use the Blazor, the core Blazor runtime that works in both client and server mode, and just use that to render the component. But there's no the sort of classic Blazor runtime isn't here. So there's no notion of environment you're running in.
Yeah, cool. So any hosting model, you're ready to go with bUnit.
Well,
yeah, exactly.
So crazy question there then, because you did mention when you were showing this slide also Blazor mobile bindings. Would that work there as well?
So in theory, yes. So the I've been talking to, sorry, I forget his name, the lead on the mobile Blazor bindings.
Elian?
Yeah, exactly. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. And actually that might be a good way to answer another question that I sometimes get. So you can see there are a couple of downloads for Blazor. That's Blazor bUnit.web, that's bUnit.xUnit, and that's bUnit core. So the core parts of bUnit is something that I've designed in such a way that I would be able to support the SAML and the Blazor mobile bindings as well. Then we would have to add another package called bUnit.mobile or something like that, because bUnit.web provides the angle sharp bits and all that, querying the DOM and finding elements and handling clicks and stuff like that. But with mobile bindings, we are not generating a markup, HTML markup. We're generating, I guess, a SAML, right? So there would need to be something that would sort of take that XML and represent that to the user in a similar way that we're doing here right now. So I've sort of laid the path for us to support it. So you could basically have the exact same syntax. You render component, and all the component tree and all the component logic and the component model is the same between the two. So it's just what we are working with on the other end when we get something from the component. It's not going to be HTML, it's going to be sample. So we need a replacement for some of the green stuff in here.
Yeah. Cool.
Cool. Well, we are just about done. But I had one question that I was kind of curious to know about, which is, you mentioned in your README that bUnit is still on the path to 1.0. Oh, perfect timing. Yeah. What's on the road to 1.0? And there you go.
Yeah. So I've been asking myself that question a few, like what is stopping me from saying this is done? This is fine, just use it. And I honestly believe, based on the number of bug reports I get and the feedback I get, that it's very stable and it's ready to use. So for me, the beta moniker is more of, I kind of want to, tweak the APIs once in a while still, but I think we are very close. And actually, the next release I will call. I'm going out of my comfort zone and going to call it a preview, which means it's probably going to be bug fixes or maybe additions from there, and not changing anything else, like in changing the existing APIs. So that is something I want to get done. Obviously, I can't promise any timeline because full-time job and full-time family, and then bUnit on the side. That's just how it is. But people are very welcome to come in and participate in anything and everything they can in the repository. There's issues there. Mostly are just my ideas of things I want to do, but I have some great engagement from many community folks that come in and provide feedback for issues, and I even have some contributors who help out with writing code for things. You have to sort of be ready to get a bit deep into the weeds of how Blazor works, and hopefully maybe this introduction today can help sort of bridge that gap a little bit. But other than that, I think that's normal for any open source project, I guess. But I would like to get the Razor-based testing parts like really work. Maybe that's something that sort of comes a little bit after 1.0, I guess, at some point. But the Razor-based testing is something I actually didn't show today. But it's sort of a way where you can write your whole component setup, and even some of the markup you would want to use in your component. You can write it in Razor code. So you can create a Razor test component where you write your test inside.
Do you have a sample maybe in the docs you can show us real quick?
I do. That's smart thinking there. So this is the website and documentation, and so writing test in Razor syntax. So this is the hello world, just a basic component.
I want to see the magic close. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, that's maybe too much. Like so. So, if we have a very simple component like this, a hello world component that just does this, and we want to write a test for it, we can create a new Razor file called hello world test.razor, for example. It just has to inherit from test component base, and then we have something called a fixture component, where inside the component under test subcomponent, I guess, we can write any markup we want to test. So I didn't show a lot about passing parameters to component, but if you have a component that takes a lot of parameters or maybe a lot of child components, then this might be much more natural and easy way to sort of write out your component. And then for the fixture component, we provide a method that it should run when it runs the test. And this is going to be this guy here, and it receives the fixture. And then we can say to the fixture, give me the component under test, and I expect that to be a hello world component. And then you can sort of go into the regular markup matches where you can expect the thing. There's even basic snapshot testing where you can, for example, define a snapshot test like where you have your test input again defined as something, just any markup, Blazor markup, or what regular markup you want to have as input, and then you can define your expected markup as output here, and that will actually use the semantic comparison under the hood. And if you have any special setup needs for your test, you can add that through code like so. But that's another thing you can do as well. So, but that's something right now that only works with XUnit. I would like to invest more time in that so that it will also work with NUnit, for example, or MS Test. If you want to see a lot of examples of this, you can join into what's it called, C# Fritz or Jeff Fritz on his Twitch show. He uses bUnit for his web forms component library in Blazor, and he has taken to this approach of using Razor-based testing. So that's his default. So he uses that quite a lot. So that's a good way to get introduction to that.
Very cool.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the show, Egil. I had a lot of fun seeing all the features and the demos and stuff. It was super fantastic. Do check out the bUnit repo, folks. As you mentioned, there's tons of opportunities to help out on the road to v1.0. We'll get there soon. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks, John, for coming on the show, helping me out. It was super.
You're welcome.
Thanks, folks, for watching live.
And we should tell people too, so that we're planning from here on out the second Tuesday of every month. So the next one will be December 8th. So this month was a little bit weird due to .NET Conf and everything. But so second Tuesday of every month, we'll have the Blazor Focus show.
Yes.
Awesome.
Thank you
for having me.
Cool.
Thanks, folks, for joining us. See you next time.